Good afternoon, and on behalf of People Mode, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, How do Leaders Manage Psychosocial Hazards in the Workplace? My name is Sharon Knighton, and I am a founder and the Managing Director of People Mode. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. I just wanted to let you all know that this event will be recorded and sent to those who have registered following the presentation. During the presentation, if you can please keep your microphones on mute so that everyone has the ability to hear clearly. And when we move into the question section following the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to unmute and ask any questions then. I have Cherry Ward from Bluebird Leadership with me today, and Cherry will be monitoring the questions that can be logged in the chat section. Feel free to pop those in as we go along. Or as I mentioned previously, you can also then have the opportunity to ask questions live to our panelists once the formal presentation has completed. Speaking of our wonderful panelists, I'd like to now introduce you all to them. They are Belinda Winter, Dr. Tristan Casey, and Kelly Ray. So Belinda is a qualified lawyer and HR specialist, skilled in providing support to employers in employment, industrial relations, discrimination, and safety law. Belinda is experienced in conducting complex workplace investigations in response to safety-related incidents, as well as providing advice to clients about safety compliance matters. She's also a qualified trainer in mental health first aid and regularly provides training to workplaces. Dr. Casey is an implementation scientist at QUT who specialises in advancing the science of safety through applied organisational research and developing measures to help companies diagnose challenges, track progress and evaluate interventions. Simply put, Dr. Casey helps organisations turn contemporary safety ideas into operational practices. And finally, but certainly not least of all, we have Kelly Ray. Kelly is a behavioural scientist, accredited coach, and executive people advisory partner. She's a strong believer in fostering a learning culture built on psychological safety and dovetailing that with a structure of accountability. Kelly coaches leaders to set the tone for their team culture and subsequent team performances. So I think, Belinda, I'm going to start with you. I think this is really important for us to firstly understand exactly what the changes to the Work Health and Safety Code of Practice actually involve. This is a change that we know is effective in Queensland from the 1st of April. However, it's already come into effect in other states, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and WA, and will also come into effect in Northern Territory from the 1st of July. I think it would be really good to understand what the requirements are for organisations and employers under the new code. But I think firstly, I would just like to clarify for everyone on the call, what is a psychosocial hazard? Because obviously it's a term that is being thrown around a lot at the moment, and it's actually really good to understand what it is that they are referring to when they talk about psychosocial hazards. So according to the Work Health and Safety website, the code defines a psychosocial hazard as a hazard that arises from or relates to the design or management of work, the working environment, the workplace interactions or behaviours, and may cause psychological and physical harm. If we have a look at what some of the common ones would be, you'll get a much better understanding of exactly what they're referring to. So common psychosocial hazards are things like high or low job demands, low job control, so lack of autonomy, poor support, low role clarity, poor organisational change management, low reward and recognition, poor organisational justice, poor workplace relationships, remote or isolated work, poor environmental conditions, traumatic events, violence and aggression, bullying and harassment, including sexual harassment. The reason why these are classified as hazards is that we know that they can cause both psychological and physical harm, and that is including anxiety and depression, burnout, things like PTSD and sleep disorders. And those psychological hazards can actually manifest as physical symptoms as well, and things like stomach ailments are quite common. Cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure can all be exacerbated or even caused by these psychosocial hazards. We know that chronic stress can exacerbate previously existing conditions and actually make them worse. So, Belinda, is there anything else that you can think of that that psychosocial hazards can actually cause?
It can even result in death, by suicide. So
yes, and
quite serious.
We debated, I know, when we were discussing this leading up to whether that was, we should actually bring that up. But I think it is important because you're talking about this is the absolute worst case scenario, but it has been known to happen. And in the workplace, it's not just physical threats and physical incidences that can cause extreme outcomes such as death. It can be caused by some of these workplace behaviours or environment that we've just discussed. And I think, it's really important that we acknowledge that. And obviously that's on the very extreme end, and we never want to get to that point where that is actually happening in workplaces. But even people that are impacted to a lesser degree, I guess you could say, have very strong and ongoing ramifications to their health. And I personally have spoken to people who have been impacted by some of these things in the workplace, and years later they are still seeking support and undergoing treatment. And in fact, it has been shown that a mental health injury can take up to 9 times longer to be resolved than an actual physical injury.
That's right.
So, yes, so these are things that are really, really important for organisations to be aware of, obviously. So, we have established what the risks or the hazards are and why it's important that they be managed. So maybe if you can give us a bit better understanding now of what the new code of practice is all about and how it's designed to sort of help organisations address some of these things.
Yeah. So the first thing is that it's not a new obligation. We've always had, PCBUs, that's persons conducting business or undertakings, and officers have always had an obligation to ensure, so far as reasonably practical, the health and safety of workers. And when we talk about health and safety, we talk about physical health and safety as well as psychological health and safety. So that's not new. What's new is there was a lack of focus on psychological safety. So they've now created this code of practice, which provides practical guidance to employers on how to identify psychosocial hazards and risks and how they can minimise those risks. And they've done this through the code of practice. And in Queensland, there is a legal obligation to follow or comply with a code of practice unless a person can show that they have implemented a method that's either equal to or better than the method for minimising the risks set out in the code, which I would challenge. The code's very, very thorough. So the code's a useful tool because it sets out and identifies for us what the psychosocial hazards are, but then it sets out a risk management framework. So it talks about, well, how do we identify psychosocial hazards in our workplace? How do we assess the risk of those psychosocial hazards in the workplace? How do we implement effective control measures? And then how do we monitor and review the implementation of those control measures? And of course, throughout this whole risk management process, there is this obligation to consult with workers. And of course, they're the best source of information as to what the psychosocial hazards are in the organisation. And there's a separate code on that. There's a separate code on consultation and cooperation as well.
Yes. And if organisations fail to make any changes or to observe this new code of practice, what is the risk to the organisation and, you know, to directors and perhaps other individuals in the organisation?
So, because the obligations have always been there, there's always been this risk. But what I think's happened now is for the first time, we've got this really prescriptive system for employers and officers to follow. So there's this real laser focus and attention being given to psychosocial hazards. Because we didn't talk about this 10 or 15 years ago, really. This wasn't really a thing. So I think in practical terms, what is this going to mean? I think employees or workers are going to be talking about it more. They're going to be talking about their psychological safety. They're going to perhaps be making more demands about what should be done in the workplace to minimise risk to them. They could make a complaint to the regulator. So because of the laser focus, they might go, well, no, I'm not satisfied with what the employer is doing. I'll make a complaint. And of course, that can be investigated. If you have HSRs in the business, so that's a health and safety representative that has been properly trained in providing provisional improvement notices, you could find a HSR comes up to you and says, well, show me your risk assessment on our psychosocial hazards. And if you say, well, I don't have a document that does that, they might issue a provisional improvement notice, which requires you to provide documentation and go through the process. You could have a situation where there's notifiable incidents. So if someone engages in self-harm, or there's even a hospital admission or something related to psychological health, you could find yourself having to notify. You've had to in the past, but again, we haven't had the focus in the past. You could be prosecuted. So companies can be prosecuted for failing to meet their duties. Officers, as defined in the Act, can be prosecuted. Individuals can be prosecuted. Workers can be prosecuted. So, you know, nobody wants to go through that. And then, of course, workplace health and safety have a number of things they can do apart from prosecution. They can implement an improvement notice telling you to do things. They can implement a prohibition notice telling you not to do things, or they can give you an on-the-spot fine. So I actually think while the law hasn't changed that much, the practical application of the law has. That's the scary thing for employers. There's a lot more to do.
Yes, I agree. And obviously it's a topic that people are becoming much more aware of. So yes, I think it's very timely. But as you say, the law hasn't actually changed, but I think the way we're viewing it now and our understanding about what employers' responsibilities are in an organisation have definitely changed. So I guess, you know, for an organisation with these looming deadlines, what would be the first thing that any organisation should do right now if they haven't already started to address this issue?
I think a lot of employers have some really good sort of systems and processes in place to look after people's well-being. And I think most employers are not too bad at that. What they haven't done is they haven't documented them. So there's no safe work method statement. There's no policies and procedures, you know, even to the point of a grievance procedure. You know, so I think the first thing is to document the good stuff that you do have. That's the first thing. The second thing is to form a workplace health and safety committee or a consultative committee, or get a bunch of people together who are interested about psychosocial hazards and psychological safety, and talk about what the hazards are in your workplace, and start working through, well, what documents, what systems can we implement? So I think you can do that. Some other things that you can do are some simple things. Have regular check-ins with workers, in particular remote workers. Act on complaints. Don't let behaviours go to the keeper. If you see sexual harassment, bullying behaviours in the workplace, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. You can't do that anymore. Reward employees, manage workloads, get people engaged in work-life balance, whatever that means for them, workplace flexibility. There are lots of tools. If you go to Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, they have a survey that you can use to give to your employees. They have toolkits for employers. They have case studies and stuff. So if you haven't done anything, jump on the website and use these free tools.
Yes, 100%. And I think, everything you've said is absolutely spot on. Having discussions, having group discussions, getting people involved and talking openly about this is going to be key, because we're talking about often, mental health or behaviours that aren't quite as obvious to everyone. Unless we're talking about it, it's not like there's a physical object in the room, the way that you can manage physical health and safety, where you can actually identify where there's a risk. When you're talking about people, when you're talking about people's brains and their reactions and the way they feel, it's so different for everyone. So the only way we're going to get to the bottom of that is by continually having these discussions. And Tristan, I'm going to throw to you now. Thank you, Belinda. That was amazing, and really great to understand exactly what the code will cover. Tristan, you're obviously very familiar with the Work Health and Safety Act and the new code, and the work you do is to provide organisations with some practical applications of safety science. So we've already started this discussion. Why is it so important for workers to have a supportive workplace environment?
Yeah, no, great. Thank you for the introduction. And I guess this area is just so important to do these types of events because it's such an unclear, murky topic. I mean, we've got, there's sort of technical jargonistic terms like psychosocial, which, industry is often wondering, what does this actually mean? And can sometimes be a little bit kind of off-putting or isolating, how do we communicate this to our workforce, that type of thing. And we've even got different terms that kind of get used overlappingly in terms of like psychological safety. There's different meanings, what that actually means in practice. So I think it's really good that we're getting together today to talk about these things. So why should they have a supportive culture? Well, I think Belinda, expertly already touched on some of this with legal obligations and whatnot. And I just wanted to kind of expand on that first point to say that, it's sort of a melting pot. It's all the threads are coming together at the right time now, where we've had historically initiatives like the Heads Up program, PricewaterhouseCoopers and all the other sort of mental health organizations getting together to put a spotlight on this issue. There's sort of a societal change where expectations and beliefs are evolving and becoming more kind of supportive of psychosocial health in the workplace. Incidents and unfortunate suicides and other sorts of events that have really triggered, more attention on this issue. And even regulators, I think, are starting to become more savvy, and their own internal capabilities have risen dramatically around what to look for and how to enforce this area. So in Queensland, the example that comes to mind for me, because I've worked at Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, is their priority notices that where inspectors do have sort of targets to look for in terms of specific issues in workplaces. And to my knowledge, there might even be in the future some psychosocial aspects there that they no longer have discretionary capability over. They just have to issue fines and sort of engage in more of that compliance and enforcement activity rather than education and awareness. So I think It's sort of all these forces coming together from a legal perspective, but really importantly, from more of a business perspective, having a supportive or inclusive culture just has so many positive benefits. Our research and others that have done hundreds of studies in this area show that just that little snippet of the inclusive culture, which we might talk about in terms of that concept of psychological safety, that willingness to be yourself, to be authentic, to be open, to share concerns and ideas without fear of repercussion or negativity. That little element of a culture in itself is related to innovation, productivity, performance, a whole host of different outcomes. So just by getting that right, you discharge or hopefully discharge the majority of your legal obligations, but also your business performs better as well. So that's kind of the quick answer, I guess, if that was quick, Sharon.
Yeah, no, I know. The key is we have a limited time today. Otherwise, I'm sure everyone here, we could talk about this for days.
Exactly.
And that was always my concern is running a webinar like this, is how do I get as much information out in the shortest possible time? So no, I appreciate that. And when we talk about, workplace culture, how does that actually fit into this discussion? Because I know, as you've mentioned, we need to have, ideally you want to have an environment where people actually feel safe to raise concerns, and that's what true psychological safety looks like. But there are a lot of cultures out there, and I have conversations every day with individuals who are working in organizations where they simply don't feel safe speaking up, so they are struggling. But instead of being able to voice their concerns, the exact opposite is happening, and they're actually becoming more and more disengaged and more impacted by potentially what can be bad or toxic culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, because I think psychosocial hazards are unique in that the type of environment in which the employees are situated can be a barrier to actually employers finding out that they exist. So in other words, if you have a toxic kind of negative culture, you try and consult or you try and change, people are not going to feel comfortable speaking up. So there's potentially a lot of things going under the radar that the employer, the PCBU, just doesn't know about. Different layers of leaders being less or more effective in their leadership styles, their ability to create that supportive, inclusive team culture. So yeah, I think it's a big risk and a unique challenge as we implement these kind of regulations and requirements.
Yeah, and so just on that, what kind of culture should organisations or should businesses be aiming for if they're really going to be addressing psychosocial hazards? Sorry, Tristan, are you there?
Had a little glitch.
That's okay.
As we do.
Absolutely.
I think the first place to start is a really helicopter view and say that we need to challenge the idea of a homogenous or like a consistent culture, because we've sort of been programmed to think that we're aiming for the almond mix. Everyone sort of has to think the same, be programmed the same for an organization to have a good or an effective culture. I think we need to aim for more of a heterogeneous, or what we call a trail mix culture, where we recognize the fact that there's lots of different nuts and seeds and chocolates all coming together. We're all different. We all kind of combine and interact dynamically to produce this kind of emergent performance in the organization. That's sort of my first recommendation. It's like a mentality or a philosophy shift on what is a good organizational culture. Now, the second piece, the more specific piece and less abstract, is there's just so many models of organizational culture out there. We can pick a handful and say any one of these is a good one. One I like is the competing values framework by Cameron and Quinn. And that talks about things like leaders being mentors, cooperation and teamwork being encouraged, the strong sense of community and togetherness in the organization. And HR practices are focused in on what we might call high performance work systems. So high quality training, fair and equitable and transparent decision-making processes, good quality recognition, and just really good sort of HR as a foundation for that inclusive, supportive culture. So it sort of turns the HR function from a cost center into a value creator. We're really, enabling HR and other related disciplines, even safety, to help push the organization in that direction.
Yeah. And, what we're talking about here too is a leadership issue. It's about, how do you create leaders, or how do you support leaders, moving away from the older style of just telling people what to do, and then checking in on them. How do you support leaders in creating or building trust, creating autonomy, fairness and equity, all of those things. And, how do you do that with leaders without also pointing the finger at them, because they are people too. And often when I have this discussion about leaders, it's sort of like, well, we need to remember that they are people. They're often caught between two levels as well. We need to support them, but we need to support them in helping build their teams and strengthen their teams.
Yeah, no, great, Sharon. I think leaders, like your point there about them being people, the obligations or the duties that they're applicable to the leaders because they're also workers. So the psychosocial environment can also be a negative one for leaders and managers in the business just as much as the frontline personnel. So we need to remember that all levels of the organization these requirements apply to. I think the key point about supporting leaders, I like to use the concept of stigma. So stigma is often this sort of idea that there's an automatic kind of unconscious reaction to perhaps different phenomena, and mental health and well-being can be one area that becomes stigmatized. So for leaders, they may have latent stigma where they perhaps discourage or quieten workers that want to report these types of issues because, well, it creates more work, or it's difficult to resolve, or it's just not in my perceived role identity to deal with. Or indirectly, where they just perhaps the way they respond, perhaps they might jump to a blame or an individual focus for when events happen, rather than thinking about the broader system and how the organisation might have contributed to that outcome. So I think it's sort of that. I like to use the stigma concept as a central kind of concept that leaders can start to unpack and appreciate, and then map on, well, how do my behaviours perhaps influence that sense of stigma, that kind of almost the antithesis of a psychologically safe culture is that stigmatized kind of perception.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, we have the only thing we can 100% control, I guess, is us and our behaviours. And, I know with leadership, it's about getting people to address that initially. And, there's a self-awareness piece in there as well. But also as a leader, you then are responsible for leading a team, and it's important that you can then distill those values that you want to see other people reflect. It's important that they come from you as well. So empathy, patience, humility, all of these great things. We're now expecting our leaders to have all of those qualities, and they're quite different to some of the qualities that we've previously looked for in our leaders. So I can imagine out there, it's a very challenging landscape for some people.
It's almost that cliche, Sharon, of where this saying, we promote the technical experts, and those people get put into the leadership roles, and maybe they don't have the necessary skill sets or at least the support and development they need to be successful in those roles.
Exactly.
So I think for every leader, they've got a range, some more empathetic than others, some more inclusive and diversity sensitive than others. We can kind of align a little bit and get some consistency in that approach. But again, it's just as much as a leader needs to know the individual personalities of their team, their workers. Managers and executives need to know the personalities of those that report to them, and what sort of coaching and support they need to make better decisions to help this sort of psychosocial initiative or the requirements become more satisfied in the organization.
Yes, I agree. And I know you go into organisations and you actually do this, so you're on the ground there. What evidence have you seen in helping organisations actually create these environments? How does that translate into tangible business benefits and results?
I think the biggest kind of carrot or lever here is really that idea of employee engagement. So that's kind of the magic bullet that people are looking for currently, post-COVID, with struggling to hold on to workers. Turnover intentions are high. It's people are scrambling for talent. So it's about how do we differentiate, how do we attract and retain and really build our capabilities in this kind of dynamic job market that we face ourselves with at the moment. So I think that's really the best mechanism that we can sort of get that happening. The theory suggests, we call it the job demands resources model, this idea that with the right balance of demands and resources, we get good engagement, reduced burnout, and that's associated with all the great organizational outcomes in terms of retention, productivity, safety performance, a whole host of things. The interesting piece about that model, which I might just raise a question later, is this idea that not all job demands are necessarily a bad thing. We can divide them into challenge and hindrance stresses. So challenge stresses are really those engaging, like, time pressure on its own is not a bad thing. It's sometimes motivating. But the hindrance stresses are always a negative thing, where they be like bullying or ostracism or negative social relationships. So we can get a little bit more nuanced, and not all of those traditionally psychosocial hazardous situations may actually be a negative effect on the person. Depends how they're framed.
There's a whole section around, or a whole lot of research around, how you can make certain stresses your friend. And as you previously mentioned, there are some of us, I'd say myself included, who, when put under time constraints, I feel like I can do my best work, but at the same time, it needs to be done in a healthy way. And obviously workplace bullying and things like that is not the kind of stressful environment you want to create.
No, with just no matter how much support you kind of give in the organisation, it's not going to mitigate the negative effect.
Yeah. And so from your research, what have you been able to find about different leadership styles and how they impact psychological health and safety?
Sure. So I think one of the challenges I keep seeing again and again is this sort of decisional paralysis amongst leaders, that now that all these new regulations and obligations are in, to sort of focus on diversity and inclusion, well, does it mean I can't even do a performance appraisal anymore? Can I not deal with some of the challenges as a leader that I need to? And that's really the elephant in the room for many leaders, I think. And so a lot of the training packages and programs that leaders are exposed to, you really have to pace out that objection before you get stuck into the skills, because otherwise they'll be sitting there thinking, well, how do I actually do my day job? How do I manage staff in this kind of complex environment? So I think the things that seem to work best are more as realistic as possible. This sort of interactive role plays, as we know, to try and get leaders more comfortable with the different scenarios that are realistic to them. Also, the idea of this sort of more complex styles of leadership, which look at how do we bring different goals and objectives together rather than prioritizing one thing over another. So, for example, the whole safety first mentality is something that it's a very popular notion, that you have to have safety has to be number one all the time to be a safe, kind of effective organization. But the more difficult and perhaps complex discussion that leaders need to start having is, well, the organization exists to produce, the organization exists to deliver a service. How do we do that safely? How do we do that kind of core business with the psychological or psychosocial considerations baked in? I think that's more, that alleviates some of the tension of the leaders. They can start to speak more freely about the challenges they're having.
Yes, and because it is very much about understanding, well, what does psychological safety actually mean, and what isn't it? So there's still accountability in psychological safety. It's not, everyone's free to do whatever they want all of the time. And I think there is a bit of a, like any of these terms, there is some, there is some misinformation out there about what it actually is. So I think it's really important in an organisation that you're really clear about what psychological safety is and isn't, and that your employees know that.
Yeah, just digging into that one comment there, Sharon, about the accountability thing. It's we can draw some lessons from safety science and systems thinking. This idea of shifting from a retributive kind of disciplinary approach, which is who broke the rule, what did they do wrong, that more blame and traditional accountability model, to something that we call restorative justice and accountability. So it's more forward looking. It's about, well, how do we help that person recover or repair the damage? What story can they tell so we learn? You're still getting accountability, but it's just the mechanism's much more different. It's the difference in regulator land between issuing a prosecution or a penalty fine and an enforceable undertaking. The latter, you're actually getting the organisation to help improve the status quo for everyone. So they're still held to account per se for their action.
Absolutely. And we, as I said before, we could talk about this for hours and days, but I'm going to bring Kelly into the discussion now as well. Kelly is a practitioner associate at the coalface, if you like, working with organisations and seeing the impact of culture and leadership on psychological safety and psychosocial hazards in the workplace. So, Kelly, initial thoughts from the field, if you like, as it relates to the new code?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Belinda and Tristan around this isn't new, but it's definitely now more focused. So the conversation we've been having in the field is we're already doing these kind of things. We've got injury process management processes in place, but I appreciate the increased focus. It's for good reason around factors like the recovery process you mentioned, how long it takes people to get back to work, the time off work when it's a psychological issue as opposed to a physical issue sometimes, and of course any ongoing impacts to their mental health. I think also if I put an organisational development lens on it, organisations I think have been doing what they can, but we're also working in a time of dramatically fast-paced change. So I think the kind of things we would when we'd assess things like job demands, job controls, is my structure right? I think we've done that traditionally on a much more periodical basis. But the pace in which we're now working requires us to do that quicker and faster and more frequently. So I think there's opportunity for us there to lean into those what were previously periodical reviews at the organisational level and get some action on those if they haven't been done in a while.
And so what is your view on how the code change might actually manifest itself in organisations?
I've taken a lens on this a little bit like Tristan's in terms of, look, a leader is daily reminded that everyone is so different. So how this might manifest for any individual or any single person really can vary. What comes to mind for me in the space that we work in here is David Rock's SCARF model, which I'm sure many have heard of, and how we each have different drivers, different triggers, and how we're going to respond to the same situation. So the job environment, the context, role requirement, it may feel like a different experience entirely depending on the people that are in those spaces and those drivers and triggers. So I think there we could look at building skill in identifying individual needs. So for leaders, and you mentioned it with the requirement of what we expect from leaders these days is different. How do we help them and have that training and skill to be identifying those individual needs, those individual differences? And I think that's not separate from building self-awareness. I think that's at the forefront of all of this. So leaders and self and others. What are our own triggers and drivers? So we've got the opportunity to address things real time.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you've brought up the SCARF model. As you know, it's a favourite of mine. I've actually had a bit of fun with some teams in workshops where I get them to read through firstly what the 5 drivers are. So for those of you on this call who are not familiar with SCARF, they are significance, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So these are 5 social drivers that we need. We need each of them, but we'll have different needs in different areas at different times. So I actually get teams to fill out what they believe their hierarchy of needs are.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as they're feeling, again, in a safe space, I get them to share with one another. And the recognition that comes out of that in those moments where people go, oh, wow, now I understand. You're a person who needs a high level of certainty. I'm a person who's very much driven by autonomy. This is why sometimes we have trouble communicating. And just having that understanding can just change the conversation going forward. So again, but we expect people to sometimes understand this without them being given that support and that training.
Yeah, agree. And I think we even expect of ourselves who have had the training to get it right in every moment, which I can tell you is not always the case either.
No, that's the thing. And again, a psychologically safe workplace means that you can make mistakes and feel comfortable in owning up to them. If you're not in a psychologically safe environment, you will tend to either not own up to the mistake or try and blame someone else. And that's, that's behavior that we want to try and avoid. So just on that, what are your thoughts around, are organisations doing enough to train and support their leaders? Has that been your experience out there?
It's a really interesting space, this area, because I'm sure, like many people, I've read the $1 billion leadership development industry. So we do pour a lot of funds into leadership development. So I think in general terms, it's fair to say that organisations do invest in leadership. Relative to this topic, though, identifying psychosocial hazards and or improving psychological safety and the training components for that, have we done that? I think that's pretty new. So this laser focus and even the differentiating between those terms and understanding what those are, I don't think that has been trained, that knowledge and ability piece. So yeah, I think that there's opportunity to invest further in those particular spaces, like acknowledging that leaders are primarily there to deliver work through others. So how do we improve that skill set and help them in taking accountability for those frameworks and how they show up in their teams and hold others to account?
Yeah. And, we do see behavioural challenges in teams. Any ideas or any thoughts on how, have you worked in a great team environment? Have you had that experience yourself? Do you know what it's like when you have an environment where people feel safe bringing their truly authentic self to work? And if so, what were the factors around that, and how do you think that could be created in other teams?
Luckily, I have had this experience, which is really great. There is no one size fits all solution, I think, for this one. But I have experienced a really great team, and I've actually seen some of them on this call. So, hi. And look, the factors, and I think the training that we have in the OD space enables us to be able to unpack why that did work and what was so successful about it. So, I've been fortunate enough to be a part of a small team. There was only 4 of us. Who are very different from each other. So in terms of personality traits, skill profiles, the things we were bringing to the same role. So when we got together, the experience I had in that group was that it was like all the perspectives in the room were putting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. So you would hear this other opposing and different view, but then go, I see how that comes together. And that's exactly how 5 of my leaders is going to respond. So whilst it might not have been where my mind or experience or style would have immediately gone, we've had this, this amazing opportunity to hear from others that were different, and we really embraced that diversity. So that's probably one of the key pieces, the embracing of the difference. But also, I think, hats off to everyone that was in that group, there was genuine curiosity about other humans and our experience and that real willingness to learn. So I think those were the key ingredients that really brought us together and let us leverage off those differences instead of holding them against each other.
Yes, you've just touched on something really important, and that's really dear to me, actually. As a leader, always be curious. If you can replace that initial threat response, because as human beings, often when we're faced with something new or something that we haven't had direct experience in, we can have a threat response. But if instead of acting on that, we can replace that with curiosity, and ask those questions and try and understand more about why that person might be thinking that. It just changes the whole experience. And when you can do that, that's actually a growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset, which is where we want our leaders to be.
Yeah.
It's not always, can be very difficult to get people to that point. So I guess, if we're talking on a practical note, how do you address some of these factors that are sometimes out of people's control when they're working in a job and they're not enjoying things, things aren't as fulfilling as they want, and you've got a leader who's trying to get them to the next level? How would you approach this situation?
I'm really glad you asked this one, because for me, this is kind of the other side of the coin, in that we all still have responsibility. We don't all get to necessarily come to work and design every facet and factor of our job. At the end of the day, we are part of a bigger organisation, and we're a piece in that the bigger interplay. So sometimes there are parts of our roles that we can't change, or we need to accept, or that might just might not suit our style. So I think it's important to remember that, we are here for the one outcome, for the organisational view as well. That's got to be a factor. So I think, taking influence and control of what I can influence and what is within my control, and accepting that some things are just not, and that's part of the role. So you're kind of going in with your eyes wide open when you are taking a role, raising those concerns with a leader and addressing what can be addressed. But if they can't be addressed, that's a different conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And if only there was a one-size-fits-all solution to this particular issue, which we know that there's not when you're dealing with people, and all the complexities that go with that. There's certainly some good in that when you talk about diversity, and everyone's going to bring something different, but there's also a lot of challenges, as we know. We've talked about the threats to organisations. From the code and from managing psychosocial risk. However, I'd like to actually talk about what is the opportunity here, because I think there's always an opportunity in any situation, and it's about how you view it. So would you say that there is opportunity in this space, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably going to sound far more simple than it is, but I think the greatest opportunity is that, and Tristan might have touched on this, is that we use the feedback as an indicator and not be afraid of it. So if I'm a leader and I receive some feedback from a team member that something isn't working, or it's just not sitting right with them, leaning into that curiosity and thinking, okay, I've got to lean into this. What's the review that I do here? So is it picking up a model? Is it picking up a framework? To asking for my HSA or HRBP support? For me, that's the immediate work on the ground that we can do, is show up as a leader and think about what is next from this, using that as an indicator to move forward and support the situation.
Absolutely, 100%. And having worked in a team myself where there's been high levels of psychological safety and feeling that you have that trust to sort of extend beyond your reach and reach for the sky, if you will. I understand also the benefits that being in a team like that has to the organisation, how you are more able to collaborate and innovate in that space without fear of making a mistake and letting the team down. So, and I know that there are tools out there that can actually measure potentially the increase to an organisation's bottom line when you have high functioning teams like that. And that's, that is the goal that we want to get to. Yes, we want to avoid psychosocial hazards. We want to avoid having a negative impact on people's mental health, obviously as an organisation, but at the same time, we also want to be able to empower people to actually, have high-performing teams. That's the other side of this. We want to avoid psychosocial hazards, but we also want to increase productivity and innovation out there, because there's so many things coming up in our future, and so many, as you say, life is really changing rapidly. There's always new issues to resolve. We need to be able to collaborate in order to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you.
Awesome. And again, we could continue on talking about this for many, many hours. I just wanted to check with Cherry and see if we have any questions that have come through from our chat.
I think there has, but Tristan has been answering them along the way.
Okay, all right. I guess in that case, we might actually throw to the floor and see if there's anyone on the call who would actually like to ask a question live. Don't be shy. Okay, do we want to, maybe some of the questions then that have been asked, if Tristan would like to actually...
Mark Gold.
Oh, yes, Mark.
Just an observation, I suppose, in terms of what we've been talking about today. You know, culture, myriad of models, etc., etc. And I suppose, as we're all aware, there are some fairly common underpinnings in terms of what a constructive, high-performing culture looks like, etc. And I suppose as we look at, for me, psychosocial issues, psychological safety, I think, is an area where there is a lot of development required, both with our leaders, but also with our people, so that they actually understand it. And I suppose for me, it's probably the next frontier in some respects, in terms of there's a lot of talk happening about it, and it's about how do we bring it to life effectively. And I suppose a realization that won't happen overnight, in terms of if I look at an organization I've worked in recently, when I joined it, no understanding of the concept of psychological safety, a lot of confusion, as I said, even within the HR folk, between it and mental health and wellbeing, seeing them as one and the same, when in fact they're not. And basically, I suppose, a realization that different leadership styles, which perhaps didn't support it, you can't change overnight. A lot of our leaders who have been in leadership positions for a period of time, as I'm sure we've all experienced, our ability to influence and to change their fundamental behaviours and approach to how they engage, lead, and work with others sometimes takes many moons to achieve adjustment. So, like everyone here on the session today, nirvana in terms of psychological safety and psychosocial issues won't happen overnight.
Really great feedback. Thanks, Mark. And I completely agree. But it also is something that we need to be having these discussions about, and information sessions and understanding more and more. And I'm just, it's actually great to be able to have these discussions, because, as I think it was Tristan pointed out earlier, that we weren't talking about this five or definitely not 10 years ago. So the fact that it's now so much on the radar is I think is a really positive thing. And yes, it's going to take time to change. But the fact is that organisations are now paying attention, and they seem to be more wanting to support people on this journey of change. And sometimes it's about, self-awareness, and obviously that varies from person to person, but sometimes it's just about giving people the basic training, the basic tools to help support them. There are people out there that have not had any kind of support in that way before. Does anyone have any other additional comments? Tristan, Kelly, Belinda, anyone want to add anything to that?
It's Mark Lindley. How are you, everybody?
Oh, hi, Mark.
Hi. That's been a great presentation. And look, just if you don't mind, Mark, look, yes, I think we shouldn't underestimate how new this is. And I know people will be going, well, it's not that new. The reality is it's probably been around far longer than we know or we want to identify. So I work with organizations, usually very large organizations, and for me, the focus in these areas is starting right at the top. And this may not translate as flavoursome. However, at the top, it is really trying to get senior stakeholders to understand the commercial impact to the business, what it does to the employees, the commercial impact that it has, the reputational impact, and a whole lot of associated areas that, for a better term, can really, really destroy a brand. And I know that this doesn't really, what we've been talking about, but I think that if we look at that other end, what I call the pointy end, or at the top of the obelisk, usually they're the breakthroughs for them to understand, and then get them to look at ways that they can adopt and transition from their thinking currently to what it should be today. I think we've been caught up a lot in physical injury, and even now people still don't get the physical injury and the associated impacts. So I think it is still a long a long haul. I think in an immensely talent drought, we can't afford to lose anybody. And more importantly, we can't afford to, have people not come to work and, leave in a worse situation psychologically than when they walked in the morning. So I think there's many different sort of facets. And if I summarize that, I would say absolutely. It's just getting it out there, talking about it. When people are fed up talking about it, keep talking about it. So that's a bit of my view or intake or experience.
And thank you, Mark. Absolutely perfectly nailed. You've hit it on the head. For some people, for those of us that have been talking about this for a long time, it feels like it's been around forever, but I know that there are people out there that are just, talking about this for the very first time. So we just need to keep having these conversations. And as I said earlier, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all take a culture pill and wake up tomorrow and be, the most amazing leaders and co-workers and peers, and that, but it just doesn't work like that. As human beings, we're all incredibly complex. So, that we need to just have these conversations and be discussing this and be open and curious. And I think, as Kelly said before, never underestimate the value of curiosity as leaders. We just need to keep understanding more about what other people are feeling and going through, and not be dismissive of anyone's experience in life. Because we don't have a work brain versus a home brain. We don't switch one off when we come to work. We don't switch off our private brain, and things that are happening behind the scenes or in people's private lives obviously going to impact them when they come to work. And we need to be inclusive of all of that. So let's just keep having these conversations. I am very mindful of our time, obviously, and sadly our time is nearly up. I will once again, I'd like to sincerely thank our 3 guest panelists, so Belinda, Tristan and Kelly. Your knowledge and expertise in your fields is truly inspiring, and I, for one, have learned a lot from today. So thank you again for your time. I just want to finish off the call to let you all know that People Mode have partnered with Conductor Software, who have a psychological safety survey. So we're currently offering a trial on their Impact Psychological Safety Survey. It's a 25-question survey based on the SCARF model that we've previously mentioned. This offer is a free survey for up to 15 people. So you could run it on one of your teams and would actually include a 1-hour debrief session. And that is designed to help you understand how you can use the data from the survey to give your leaders actionable insights and help strengthen their team dynamics. So it will actually show you where people are perhaps not feeling so psychologically safe in the team, and how we can then help you support them. So if you're interested in finding out more about this offer, or you just wanted to have a chat about anything that you've heard today, please reach out. You can catch me on LinkedIn or via email, or just give me a call. My details are all on LinkedIn. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on this call, and I'd like to wish you all a wonderful rest of the day, and we will be doing some further webinars around this topic, because I think there is just so much to cover. So please keep an eye on LinkedIn, and I hope to see you on one of those calls in the very near future. Thanks, everyone, and thanks again to the wonderful speakers.
Thanks, Sharon.
Goodbye.